So for this material experimentation project, I thought it would be fun to marble some paper for the first time and use it to recover an old paperback book that I had whose cover had detached from the book block. So the book that I used was John Gardner's Grendel. It's my copy from high school. It has annotations and I love the illustrations. So I had attached a super a while ago. I thought I was going to recover it and never got around to it. So here we go. I went to Above Ground Art Supply in Toronto and picked up my marbling kit and then gathered my supplies from around the house. It's pretty standard stuff. I used some non-corrugated cardboard for my covers and used some old scrap paper from a journal that I bound over winter break. I also gathered the rest of the materials that I would need, including a knitting needle that I used to swirl the colors while marbling, and the PVA glue to stick it all together at the end. The kit that I purchased included the inks, synthetic oxgall, alum, and carrageenan moss powder, as well as some handy instructions to help me out along the way. After unpacking all my materials, I tested the grain of the paper and made a note of which way the paper grain was going, just for my own peace of mind, and then mixed up the alum mixture that I needed to treat the paper with prior to applying the inks in order to help the colors be more vibrant and for them to stick to the paper better. It was just a mixture of water and alum. I ended up not being able to do the full gallon that they required, but that was all right because my containers were so small I could barely even fit what I ended up doing. I poured it into the largest pan I have, which is a 9x13, and then would completely submerge the paper in the solution for 20 minutes. Unfortunately, I could only do one at a time, so this was pretty time consuming, honestly. I needed to hang these sheets of paper to dry because I did not have enough counter space to lay them out, so I grabbed a skirt hanger from my closet and took all the skirts off, hung it in my shower so they could drip dry there. I ended up treating 10 sheets of paper. I needed 4 for the book, covers and end papers, and then thought the 6 others could just be for fun to try out different techniques. They ended up needing to dry overnight, and while I was waiting for them to dry, I cut out my covers and my spine. The next morning, I took the papers off their hanger and noticed that there had been some buckling overnight due to the air drying of the papers, but proceeded to mix the size anyways to marble them later that evening. I made half a gallon of the size, which is just a mixture of water and the carrageenan powder. I decided to make half a gallon of this mixture just due to the size constraints of the vessels I had to work in. In the instructions, it tells you to whisk or blend the substance for 10 minutes in order to thoroughly mix it. I started out using a whisk in the hopes that that's all I would need, but I ended up needing to crack out the immersion blender after whisking for quite a while and not getting all the clumps out. So I popped the immersion blender in and had a lot more success. It mixed up pretty easily at this point, which I was very happy with, but I was surprised by the cloudy consistency of the mixture. I was expecting it to be clear, and it very clearly is not. Instructions that came with this kit recommended letting the mixture sit until all of the bubbles had dissipated, or for 12 hours for the best consistency. I noticed that after all of my blending, it still didn't look quite mixed up. There's little flecks in there, so I took the blender and mixed it all up for another few minutes just in the hopes of getting a smoother solution. Here's some action shots of that, and you can see after all that mixing, it's a lot smoother, but there are bubbles on top, so I wanted to wait until all of the bubbles had popped before I started using it. I went to class and came back and was surprised to find that it was a clear liquid at this point, which was very different than what it was before, and it was totally bubble-free, which I was happy with. Now I was ready to marble. The first step was skimming the surface to make sure that there was no film that had developed during my class, and I shook up all of my colors. I wanted to not create air bubbles in there, so I just gently tipped them rather than giving them a vigorous shake. And I started going for it. So I wanted my covers to have a bit of a traditional bullseye design that I would then drag the knitting needle through to create maybe heart shapes. I had already done one at this point and a test sheet that did not go well. So that's why there's already ink in the size. And in the background here, you can actually see the first end paper that I created drying on a rack. So I was trying to keep the colors fairly consistent with what I had done for one of the covers already. And I noticed a wide variation in the consistency of the colors. So you can see here the yellow really spreads out nicely, but once I pick up this blue, it just sort of plops in there and then slowly spreads. So I think there might have been a consistency issue between the inks, which did lead to some fun design elements, but it was not a challenge to work with, but it was different than I was expecting. Layering in these bullseyes was really satisfying. I think that's one of the big things that I took away from this project was just how satisfying the actual process was. It was very meditative, even when I was stressed about making them look perfect. It sort of forced me to let go of some of that and realize that they're really pretty even if they aren't perfect. Since I didn't want to purchase too many new materials for this project, I knew that I would be using yellow fabric as part of my binding because that was the scrap fabric that I had laying around. So I wanted to make sure that yellow was prominent in this design as well as purple because it goes well with yellow. So here I am just swirling the colors together. I wanted that heart-shaped design, and then I thought these little mini snails or scrolls would be really beautiful. And you know, one of the interesting parts of this process is trying to determine when you're going to stop adding to your design and just impress it onto paper. So I got pretty close here. I thought I was done. So I laid my paper down. I tried to keep it on the surface. I end up switching that tactic later. As you'll see, I end up just submerging the paper totally under the liquid because it was a lot easier to make sure that there was full contact. Here I am working on the end papers, my first end paper. I wanted to have a little bit of fun with these and just use some colors that I hadn't used or use different techniques that I knew, you know, it's just going to be on the inside of the books, so it's not as high stakes. First new technique that I tried was flicking the paint onto the surface using a brush. I used this drinking straw cleaning brush that was by my sink to flick the paint. It was very fun, got to move with some reckless abandon, which is always appreciated, and I really liked the dimension that it added to the design. I ended up flicking it on at this point and then drawing snails in the surface and then flicking it on after I had drawn the snails to have another level of dimension. A challenge with drawing on the surface with the stylus is the momentum that your size can pick up. You can see the swirls are getting away from me here, and it's a bit of a challenge to keep them in some sort of shape while I'm working. I get my paper and I go ahead and start marbling it. This is the point at which I decided to submerge it totally under the surface, which just gave me, I thought, a little bit more control. You'll see here I left one of the corners out on accident and dipped it back in to add a little color to that corner. I wanted my second end paper to also have that same snail design. I thought it would be fun to use some more vibrant colors here as well. I lean into the purple a little bit more and draw a bit. You can see that difference in the consistency of the different inks. As you saw, the blue get drawn on and just, you know, essentially have a dotted line, and then these yellows and whites are just taking over the whole piece. I flicked the paint on as well. I really enjoyed the way that looked, and I thought it was fun to have the various sizes of dots on the surface. It added a lot of dimension, as I said before. So I'm going to try to draw these snails again. These ones get away from me even more than the first page did, but they're cute. We appreciate them. I realized while doing this that if I had had those big professional marbler tools like those big rakes and combs that they use, I probably would have had better luck with designs like this, but I really liked experimenting with the materials and realizing that, you know, the momentum of the size is a real factor, and the unpredictability of it really affects the end design, which was a good lesson to learn. So this paper was intended to be my final end sheet for the book, and at this point I thought it would be fun to experiment with some different tools and different ways of manipulating the size. You'll see my cat in this shot, and he actually was part of the first tool that I used. I borrowed one of his whiskers that I found on the carpet and used it to draw lines in the size. Then I tried mixing the different inks together and just dropping them on the surface like that, making a pink color, which was very fun. I then continued to create sort of a stone effect similar to my end papers, but I thought it would be fun this time, since I don't have a professional paper marbler's rake. I decided to try using my wide-toothed comb that is sitting next to the basin there as a makeshift rake to make some feathering designs. You'll see I do not have as much control over the size as I would like at this point. It starts out okay, and then I sort of lose it. I end up drawing more feathering patterns than I think I probably should have, and you can see the size just, it moves and then the momentum keeps it going, and it can be hard to control what is actually happening based on my actions. Perhaps that has something to do with, your ripple effects in the world, so it maybe has a metaphorical implication as well. But this was the last paper that I marbled. I was out of paper that I had prepared with alum, so I did my final clean off of the surface in order to get ink out of there, and then tried to save my size. You can see, my container was too small. That's a theme in this video, is containers that are too small. But I put it in the bottle and put it in the fridge where it remains until I have time to prepare more paper with alum in order to marble once again. After letting the paper dry overnight, hanging in my shower, I needed to remove the remaining size that had dried onto the surface. So I'm not removing the ink, I'm just removing the sort of slippery feeling carrageenan size that has remained on the paper while it was drying. So I gently run water over it and use my finger to remove it. I wanted to prevent some of the buckling that had been happening with my papers, so I laid them out, put tea towels on the tops and bottoms of them, and then pressed them flat with some heavy books. I pressed them flat overnight, and I think I probably could have left them pressing for a bit longer. It certainly did remove some of the buckling that I had seen, but it was still there, and the papers, some of them weren't even fully dry after letting them press overnight. So you live and you learn. They did turn out very beautiful, and they were significantly less buckled than before. Now that I had the paper marbled and dry and flattened, hopefully, I decided it was time to bind the book. So I took the subway over to my friend Claire's house, where we did some crafting together, and I assembled the cover and attached the book block. So here is my cover all assembled. I used 2 layers of that yellow fabric, and aside from it being kind of a messy process, I didn't have too many issues with this, as it is something I've done before. This is a little bit of a wiggly book, but it does its job. So here is the book block all assembled, ready to go in, and you can see my beautiful end papers accenting the text beautifully. So I attached it, and here is the finished product. I let it dry overnight, and you can definitely see some discrepancies in the fabric portion of the binding. There's some wiggliness there that I'm not a huge fan of, but overall I'm really happy with how this turned out. I think the end papers are beautiful. I think that the cover really pops, and I'm very proud of what I've done. I'm looking forward to trying marbling again soon.